So welcome to our event. This is actually our first one of the fall for East-West Psychology, and for the benefit of those of you who I haven't met, actually, I'm Craig Chalquist. I'm Department Chair here at CIIS. I'm going to introduce Dr. Sandra Easter and her important work on dealing with the ancestors in many different senses of that. And I wanted to go ahead and start by reading the formal introduction, so you all know a little about her background and the lenses that she uses. So Dr. Easter received her master's in applied psychology from the University of Santa Monica and her PhD in depth psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute. She's got additional training in the process of counsel, indigenous African spiritual technologies, dream tending, and the therapeutic uses of puppetry. In addition to providing individual and group counseling, Dr. Easter has worked nationally with diverse groups in both urban and rural communities, including Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York, Seattle, and rural Louisiana, providing education, advocacy, and community organization support for the last 35 years. She is adjunct faculty at Pacifica and maintains a private practice in Santa Barbara, where she offers workshops in ancestral soul work and transformational visioning for individuals and organizations. Her creative approach to teaching and counseling is informed by her love of and training in modern dance, puppetry, storytelling, and indigenous ways of knowing, and myth. And so the foundation of her work lies in the experience of the natural, undivided relationship between the embodied world and the psyche. And before I have you come up here, I just wanted to briefly mention that it's one of the greatest joys of being an educator is when you are present at that moment when somebody's vocation comes to them. And I was lucky enough to be at, I think, that very moment, actually, in the case of Dr. Easter. So it's been a real joy for me to see, after all these years, where she went with those sparks of insight that came to her in Santa Barbara, and where she has gone with this. So I'm really looking forward to getting updated on this as well. And with that, I will introduce Dr. Easter.
Thank you. Yeah, how many of you are students at CIIS? Okay, and well, when I was a first-year student at Pacifica, Craig was a third-year student. And I was in there, it's like, I found home, you know? And then we did a group council and a witness council, and the third year spoke, and I went, oh, F. So they were, you know, the possibility and the embodiment of what I was just beginning in my journey. So, and Craig was there, and Craig was actually, I resisted this topic, and for those of you who are getting your PhD, know that the resistance may be the biggest clue into your vocation. Because I resisted this. In spite of God, the ancestors, and life itself. And Craig was the one who kept kind of insisting, sometimes not so gently, that I really needed to pursue this. So thank you for that. And yeah, he was there when I was just like, what the is happening? You know, what is this all about? I'm really happy that this work is finding its way into the world. And I feel like I have a part of something that is going to be more and more recognized, not only in practice, but in depth psychological theory. Just like the goddess was like a big deal like a couple of decades ago, and it was really breaking into consciousness, I really think that the ancestors is one of those pieces that's going to be picked up more by this culture and in a significant way, and both in theory and practice. So tonight what I want to do is to introduce you to some of the basic ideas that came out of the research I did and that come out of the practice that I have. about the ways in which the ancestors are present in the present. Then I want to talk about Jung's theoretical ideas and his experiences regarding the ancestors. If any of you, how many of you have read the Red Book or any part of it? Okay, great. So when he's talking about the dead, and when I talk about Jung and the dead, I'm talking about the ancestors. When I first got kind of hit with this idea about working with the ancestors, I couldn't find things in Jung, I didn't like Jung very much, I couldn't find things in Jung that really supported me in understanding the kinds of experiences that I was having. So I had to turn to the, I did some work with Malidoma Somé, I read a lot of Vine Deloria, and I turned to people in more indigenous traditions. In writing my dissertation, and as I continued to do this work, and especially with the publication of the Red Book, I have come back to the tradition that is not only the tradition of my ancestors and my culture, but it's the tradition of the scholarship, the legacy of the scholarship that I'm in. So Jung is one of my ancestors, and it's so wonderful to have him supporting this kind of work. He's very much a bridge, I think. What I'd like to do as we start, did anyone bring anything that they'd like to put on the ancestor altar? Okay, great. So if you'd like to come and place it on the altar. And as you're doing that, I'll talk about some of the things that are up here. This scarf is a scarf that has been used in many different rituals. The first ritual it was used in was one I did with Malidoma Somé over a weekend. And it's been, actually one time we put it in a loft. We were doing a dream tending weekend. I put it in a loft, and I did this kind of invocation of the ancestors. And fire is the element for the ancestors in the Dogger cosmology. Well, the loft, we came back the next morning and there were fire trucks, and the loft was on fire. So I learned something, you know? And we brought in a friend of mine brought me a scarf from Bali that carries the water element. So that usually accompanies me.
So, oh, I'm putting them on here.
Yeah, just put them anywhere that they, either on the scarf, on the table, the big table. And I also have, you know, we're a small group. If you'd like to come up around the table, that would be great. And if not, just whatever you're comfortable with. So one of the things on the altar are ashes that have come from ancestor rituals, from the fires that we've used in ancestor rituals. And so they come with me. And this is a bell from my grandmother that came down through the lineage. And it was used in India to, I think it's an elephant calling bell. So I like to think of it as something that will help call in the ancestors. Not that they need calling, it's really that we need to open ourselves to listening. And this is the candle I have on my personal ancestor altar. So, Great Spirit was the creator and destroyer of all things, from which all things come and to which all things return. We are so happy to be here this evening, at least I am. And I ask that we open our eyes and ears and our heart to listening to the ancestors, to their laments, to their praises, to their wishes, and that everything, I just want to welcome everybody in. Give special thanks to Jung and Vine Deloria, elders that I know and the elders that are so there for all of us. And the ancestors who are always and ever present. And may what happens here tonight make them smile. Feel a lot better. Okay, you can all go home now. The work is done. Okay, that's for the heart. Here's for the mind. So there is Dr. Jung. And on the left is his autobiography, which was published first, shortly after his death. And I think, was it after his death? I should know that.
Yeah.
Anyway. And then the Red Book, which was just published. One of the things I'm going to be talking about that comes from Jung is that he talks about ideas being always and ever available. However, there is a right time for those ideas to come into consciousness. And my dissertation, and please don't hear this as inflation, my dissertation was published at about the same time that the Red Book came out. And when the Red Book came out, everyone was like, oh my God, the ancestors. And I thought, this is the time. The Red Book is what all of Jung's theoretical work, or a lot of Jung's theoretical work, came out of. So they're kind of bookends to his work, to the collected works. And what I love about the Red Book is that it is, the unconscious is completely visible. And the figures of soul are, it's a dialogue between Jung and those figures of the soul. And I'll be talking a little bit about one of the passages in the Red Book that's particularly relevant. So I want to situate this in Jung's work. And then I will be sharing some stories, my own story, and which is rich with examples, and so I'll be sharing pieces of that, and the stories of clients and other people I've worked with who I've gotten permission to share, and also the stories of two women whose books I've read that are particularly relevant. And one of the reasons I like to bring those two women's stories in is doing this work is not something that you do one ancestor dialogue and you're done. I've been doing this work for over 10 years. This work has been doing me since the day of my birth, probably before that, depending on what one believes. And it takes time, especially when there's trauma, and especially when one is dealing with the ancestral aspect of consciousness, the ancestral aspect of psyche. The healing isn't something that you can snap your fingers and it's done. So the two women's stories that I'll be sharing, in addition to my own, are stories that occurred over a longer period of time. So this work originates in my personal story. My birth date and my wedding anniversary happen to be synchronistic. Is there anyone here who doesn't know what synchronicity is? Oh, cool, okay. So, happened to be synchronistic with two dates in one of my ancestors' life. So I'll talk about that more when we get into my story. I've spent the last 10 years actively engaged in personal ritual, personal research, and dialogue with the ancestors in an attempt to come more consciously into relationship with them. It's become an important part of the work that I do with clients. What I found is when I tell my story, it usually opens up that space for people, even if they don't know the specifics of their own story, for people to kind of begin to imagine how their stories might be in that larger context. By doing this and weaving the threads of the stories of one's ancestors into the threads of your own story, what happens is you find more meaning in your personal suffering, and also a deeper understanding of what you're here to do. Now, this work is devoted to exploring our relationship with them and theirs with us, with particular attention given to the influence of their particular past on our immediate present and imagined and hoped for future. Now, I want to acknowledge that there's a diversity of perspectives about what happens after the body dies. And based on my experience, the ancestors are really real. Jung stayed very much in the theoretical camp on that and said, well, we need to look at this phenomenologically and psychologically and not metaphysically. However, I found a quote from a lecture, and he says, well, you know, after all this time, the spirits of the dead really are not, I can't differentiate them from all the figures of psyche. Not only that, but it seems to be, there seems to be a lot of evidence to substantiate that some aspect of consciousness continues after we die. For how long, we don't know. Let's not even talk about the question of immortality, but something survives. And the Red Book is full of examples. And the figures in the Red Book say, we're really real. We're as real as you are. I think the public Jung might have expressed something different than what his true experience was. And his autobiography is just filled with, anyway, he crosses the line a lot.
Yeah.
So, he wrote his autobiography as a myth, so this is one of the founding myths of depth psychology. And the Red Book, for me, is really that founding myth. Oh, that was from when I did the introduction. So I love this image. One of my students sent it to me. Every step you take is supported by 1,000 ancestors, at least. So, upper corner is Jung's dad, and that's a picture of Jung's father and his mother. And I couldn't find out who that was. Her name is Emily, or no, not Emily, Gertrude. And that's Jung, and then this is Jung, probably at about the same age that he had the dream I'm going to talk about of his father. Jung said the psyche might be that existence in which the hereafter or the land of the dead is located. So we can't really talk about Jung and the ancestors without talking about the dead and the experiences of death itself in Jung's life. So Jung's father died early in 1896, shortly after Jung began his studies at the University of Basel. 6 weeks after his death, he appeared to Jung in a dream, and he told his son that he had made a good recovery and was now coming home. Now, in the dream itself, Jung felt ashamed because he thought his father was dead. 2 days later, the same dream returned. So for Jung, this experience was, in his words, unforgettable, and it forced Jung, for the first time, to think about life after death. In response to these dreams, Jung would ask, what does it mean that my father returns to me in dreams and seems so real? Thus began Jung's interest in the dead and their communications with the living. The experience of imaginal figures as very real, in some way both dead and alive, would return years later during Jung's confrontation with the unconscious, which we see in the Red Book. Whatever one believes about what happens after our hearts stop beating, our ancestors have both a physical and psychical reality. Their bones and flesh lie in the ground on which we walk every day of our waking lives, in the ground on which we build our homes and cities, in which our food grows, and in which our bodies will also come to rest. Their stories feed our memories and define how we see ourselves in relationship to our personal and collective history and to the land that we live on. Their DNA inclines us to particular diseases and links us through time to the origins of this planet. How do we know them? How are they known to us? They speak to us through the stories that endure each generation's telling. Our conscious memories of them live in these stories, in their letters and diaries, in particular fixed moments of their lives, captured in photographs, in family heirlooms, recipes, and rituals. Over time, memories can change or be forgotten, details and emphases altered as they are subjected to each person's telling, each family's, and each culture's editing. Every memory, every story has both a conscious and an unconscious aspect. From a depth psychological perspective, every narrative has a shadow. Some memories are taken to the grave to linger in these shadows. What is absent in these stories is as important as what is present. And what is absent, like any unconscious content, returns to us through our symptoms and in dreams. The loss of stories from our personal lineage and the absence or exclusion of significant parts of our shared collective history on this continent, I would suggest, leave us standing in relationship with ourselves, our families, our ancestors, and this land and all of its people on shaky ground. These absences, this forgetting, results in gaps in the continuity, gaps in the community, gaps in the continuity of and relationship between our stories and our personal and collective history, and affects the way we live in relationship with each other and with this land. There's an old Chinese proverb, to forget one's ancestors is to be a brook without a source, a tree without a root. Some of our roots, although unconscious, still exist in the shadows of these gaps in the stories. A friend of mine who actually, I love synchronicities. I was on my way here in the bus. She didn't know I was coming to do this presentation. This is her story. And she called me as I was on my way to give this lecture, thanking me for the inspiration that I've given her. She just finished her dissertation and submitted it to her committee. So this stuff works. It's kind of amazing. I never cease to be amazed. So my friend was in an academic class, and they were in a council circle, and there was a Native American woman in her class, and I don't have her permission, so I'm not going to say her name or the name of her tribe. And she was sharing her experiences of how difficult, the Native American woman, of how difficult it had been and continues to be to live here in this country. However, as my friend listened to her story, what she heard was that this woman knew who her people were. She knew where her people came from. She knew their stories. She knew her history, and in that way, she knew herself. Her people's stories were her stories. Even with the horror of dislocation, re-education, assimilation, and genocide, this Native American woman was connected to her ancestors. This stirred a longing in my friend, and as she sat in circle listening, she felt the absence of her own identity with the people, with their stories and traditions, and with a land that connected her with her origins and with her ancestors. She felt a longing for the kind of connection which could reach back through time and into the future, connecting her to a community and to her roots. She recognized that she didn't have that same sense of belonging that her classmate had been born into. Her personal story and history had origins which were unknown to her, scattered across continents. The indigenous ground of all the peoples she had a genetic and historical connection with had been transformed by civilization and progress. Her ancestors, with their stories and traditions, were absent from her conscious way of being in the world. Her longing, inspired by another woman's story, was an indication of their presence. Where do I come from? How many of you can remember asking that question when you were a little kid? And if you have kids or grandkids or nieces or nephews or you've been around kids, that's just such a common question. Where do I come from? And where do I come from informs not only where we're going, but who we are. That's the foundation on which everything rests. I gotta find a slide that's not just like a cute little tree that Ancestry.com uses. I love this because for me, it really shows the complexity of the web, and what I invite you to imagine is that it's 4-dimensional, not 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional, because that's how I saw it in a dream. So some of us can trace our family trees through genealogical records, but even when we can, and we can, with genetic testing, even trace our ancestors back to different parts of the world. However, we only get bits and pieces, of the stories, and those bits and pieces are so valuable. What I found in my work is that the bits and pieces that come to you in particular are exactly the ones you need. You don't need the whole story. Just look at what is in your, what's coming to your attention. So following the path of our ancestors backwards, crisscrossing and crossing oceans and continents is like traveling through the levels of the collective unconscious. From the personal with its shadow of lost, forgotten, and purposefully repressed pieces of experience through the ancestral and tribal until one reaches the deeper regions of psyche and our collectively shared history. There are, like layers of civilizations, visible in an excavated tell, levels and layers of complexity in each particular and individual ancestry. What I love about this, this is from a lecture that Jung did, and this is his diagram of the collective unconscious. And I'm not going to go into detail, but there are a couple of things that are particularly relevant, and I go into more detail in the book I'm reading. The top, this little tiny piece, is consciousness. The next piece is the personal unconscious, which is what Freud was writing about, so that's the repressed memories. The next piece is the family, then the tribe, nation, and it goes down right to what Jung called the central fire. And this is the completely undifferentiated aspect of consciousness, that thing from which everything else arises. And there's a spark that goes through, and he's doing this, like, here's the individual up here, but the spark goes through all of these levels and connects all of these levels. And if you look, they're also connected this way. Again, you could just spend time looking at that diagram and see what it means to you. The other thing he differentiated was, this is an individual nation, like, let's say Australia, and this is a grouping like Europe. And so you see at the top levels, they're not related and connected, but at the lower levels they are, however, they're not connected with this. I have some arguments with different pieces of this, but I love it because it shows the differentiation, which is part of our heritage and part of that wonderful modern Western mind, but it also shows the depth of interrelatedness and connection. So from this comprehensive and differentiated picture of the unconscious, our ancestors then include those that we are connected to through our personal lineage, through our collective heritage, nationally and geographically, which includes our lineage of scholarship, our commonly shared archetypal ancestors, animal ancestors, and those who continue to live in the nature and memory of this land that we stand on. What I found is that differentiating these levels was important to understanding the nature and influence of the ancestors in the present, allowing us to see the particular thread which runs from that commonly shared central fire through all the levels right to us here as a particular expression of this larger piece. I think of us as figures as much as we think about the figures of the unconscious as figures. In fact, one of the things that I learned from Malidoma is that the way that his people see it is the people who are on the other side of the veil see us as the ghosts. It's kind of fun to think that way. So this thread that runs through us reveals itself not only in the shape of our nose and the color of our skin and eyes, it also reveals itself in family patterns like addictions, in a family lineage of priests or merchants or healers, reveals itself in our dreams and through synchronicities, especially specific dates and time. And I'm going to talk about, there's a woman, Schutzenberger, who's a Freudian, and she does a lot of ancestor work, and she came up with the term anniversary syndrome because what she found was that the birth dates and dates of death, dates of things in history, and marriage dates, all those anniversaries often were the clues that connected an individual to some very particular time in the history of someone in their lineage. And that was the part that was important for them to address. That was the piece that was addressing them. And you'll see that when I share my story. Oh, okay, fate and destiny, since that was in the title. I'd suggest that our fate is woven into this thread. Jung told students at the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich in 1958, if you are not interested in your fate, the unconscious is. See, he's not just these figures aren't just being personified. I mean, the unconscious is so real to him. Reconnecting our individual stories with those of our ancestors is one way of engaging in a more conscious relationship with the unconscious and with our fate. One's experiences in the present, one's sense of fate and destiny, personal trauma, addictions, physical and emotional symptoms, disease, or a sense that one is cursed or doomed or blessed may find multiple places of origin in the unconscious shadows of our ancestors. Becoming more conscious of its particular form and nature allows one to come into a dynamically co-creative relationship with one's fate, thus making it a destiny. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. Okay, so I was hoping that Kimmy Johnson would be here because she has I read her dissertation, and I really did have to go outside of my tradition of depth psychology when I began this work. And I read her dissertation, which was on reconnecting with the ancestors. How many of you have read her dissertation? So, one. And I was concerned because my personal story was so much a part of my work. And she has this beautiful quote that rather than a narcissistic kind of reflection, each person's individual story is part of a spiraling wheel of kinship. Mm-hmm. So we go from Jung's model of the differentiated collective unconscious to this other image of the spiral, of the interconnectedness of all of our being. Understanding the nature and origin, I should edit this, of one's individual wounding, phobias, addictions, patterns of behavior, quirks, passions, inclination, and gifts as situated within this larger collective reality allows for a depth of remembrance and healing that is more complete than if addressed only at the personal or familial level. And there's a quote in Jung's autobiography where he says, we don't take that collective level into account enough. And often what we identify as a personal problem, in fact, is a collective problem. And what I would suggest from my own experience is that it's always both and. From the perspective of Navajo, there's the individual and the cosmos, the individual community are completely connected. So a wound to the individual is a wound to the entire fabric of being. And as we see from Jung's conceptualization of the unconscious, each individual is intimately intertwined within and through all of these levels. So healing the individual heals the collective. Following this logic, individual trauma in the present may reflect and be an embodiment of ancestral and cultural trauma. Addressing the trauma within the individual in the present, listening for the echoes from the past, may begin to restore balance and harmony within the collective psyche and cosmos, as well as for the traumatized individual. Following the thread through all the levels, discovering and remembering other places of origin of the trauma, listening to what is being asked for in this moment in response can lead to significant healing. I want to talk about curing addictions when we get to the storied piece of this. It was one of the stunning things that came out of my research that I was very careful with, but got validation for. So this is Bollingen. This was built by Jung. The first central tower was built after his mother's death, and he added on another piece after his wife's death. And this is what it looks like today. He imagined it as an African hut with a hearth at its center ringed by a few stones. And the whole life of the family revolves around this central fire. No electricity, no running water. Jung chopped wood and cooked his meals on that central fire. He said the absence of electricity and telephones provided a space in which there was nothing to disturb the dead. He describes Bollingen as a place of timeless existence in which one feels as if one lives simultaneously in many centuries. So here at Bollingen, Jung felt that his ancestors' souls were actually sustained by the physical structure and through the work that he was doing. In the tower, it was, in his words, as if a silent greater family stretching down the centuries were peopling the house. There, I see life in the round as something forever coming into being and passing on. One of the things I love about Jung is there's always a sense of past, present, and future. And it's not just about what's happened in the past. It's also the pull of the future. And who we are in relationship to the ancestors goes both ways. An African Sangoma said to me as he had this dragon cane, he scared the heck out of me, and he knows how stubborn I can be. And he slammed the cane down on the table in front of me, and he said, "The ancestors are in front of you." And, I tried to wrap my mind around that, and of course I couldn't. But when Jung talks about telos, that sense of the future that pulls us, that's how I fit it into the Jungian framework. So the ancestors are in front of us, and they're also in front of us. Like, come on guys, listen. So Jung became aware of the fateful links that wove his life into the lives of his ancestors. And he wrote this about Bollingen. "I feel very strongly that I'm under the influence of things or questions which were left incomplete and unanswered by my parents and grandparents and more distant ancestors. It often seems to me as if there was an impersonal karma within a family which is passed on from parents to children. It always seemed to me that I had to answer questions which fate had posed to my forefathers and which had not yet been answered, or as if I had to complete or perhaps continue things which previous ages left unfinished." That's throughout the Red Book. That's what's going on in that conversation. That's my experience of personally being in dialogue with the ancestors and with the people that I've worked with. The dead, the ancestors, are dependent on the living to continue building on what has been learned and what has yet to be known. Although, according to Jung, unlimited knowledge is present in nature, what can be known at any particular time can only be known when the time is right. And that's what I was talking about with the ancestors. It's coming really to the foreground now. For Jung, central to this relationship between the living and dead were those unanswered questions asked by his spiritual forefathers in the hope and expectation that the ancestors would learn what they had not been able to find out during their time on Earth. And I'll be talking a little bit about the 7 sermons and the conversation Jung had with Ezekiel, because those are perfect examples of what he's talking about here. It's like, why are you here? We are the dead, come back from Jerusalem, because we're not finished. We couldn't find an answer to our question. The deaths of Jung's parents and wife seemed to open new possibilities in Jung's life, to open him to parts of psyche which had previously only been there as potential. His theoretical work progressed in significant ways following the death of his parents and wife, and as they returned to him in dreams. There are lots of examples in his autobiography of the dreams that he had that were very significant and actually led directly into, his work, Symbols of Transformation, and Mysterium, whatever, how you pronounce that, Conjunctionis. This is one I like in particular. 4 months before his mother died, his dad came to him in a dream. He hadn't had a dream about his dad for 26 years. So his dad returns, And his father appeared rejuvenated as if he had returned from a distant journey. And he came to Jung because he wanted to consult with Jung about marital psychology. Do you know, how many of you know this story? Okay, this is one of my favorites. Now, Jung didn't know how to interpret this dream. And when his mom died 4 months later, he went, oh my gosh, this was a forecast of my mother's death. My dad came to me for help because he knew she was coming to be with him again. And he wanted the most updated information he could have. I love that because Jung is so practical, and he's also just such an incredible mind and theoretician, and probably was a great practitioner. That dream led to his essay on marriage as a psychological relationship. And there's so many examples of that throughout his work. Oh, okay. So this is his house in Switzerland, and the other house he lived in when he wasn't at Bollingen. And how many of you are familiar with the 7 Sermons of the Dead? It's the last thing in his autobiography. It's the only thing from the Red Book that made it into publication before the publication of the Red Book. Okay, so on a warm summer Sunday afternoon in 1916, everyone in Jung's household heard the doorbell ringing frantically. Jung was sitting near the doorbell, and he not only heard it ringing, but he saw the doorbell moving in and out. When everyone looked to see who was there was no one. So at the moment the doorbell rang, Jung described the atmosphere as being so thick that it was scarcely possible to breathe. The whole house was filled as if there were a crowd present, filled with spirits, as if, we can take that word out, they were, because then he writes next, they were packed right up to the door. For God's sake, what in the world is this? I always love thinking about Jung actually doing that. He was such a big man and he was so earthy, and I can just see him, it's like, what? Crying out in a chorus, the ghostly procession replied, we have come back from Jerusalem where we found not what we sought. So there's an example of what we were talking about. So thus began the 7 sermons that Philemon delivered to those who came back from Jerusalem. And Philemon says, these dead ended their lives too early. These were seekers and therefore still hover over their graves. Their lives were incomplete, since no one teaches them, I must do so. That is what love demands. I must teach them so that their life may be fulfilled and they can enter into death. When I was first doing this work, it started with personal and ancestral, cultural, and ecological trauma. And where it ended up was in a story about love. The bottom line is this work is all about allowing the love to flow more freely between all things. And love in all of its forms, wisdom, answering questions, healing wounds. So reflecting on this experience when he was writing his autobiography, he wrote, from that time on, the dead have become ever more distinct for me as the voices of the unanswered, unresolved, and unredeemed. For since the questions and demands which my destiny required me to answer did not come to me from the outside, they must have come from the inner world. These conversations with the dead formed a kind of prelude to what I had to communicate to the world about the unconscious, a kind of pattern of order and interpretation of its general contents. So this was one of Jung's many visionary and dream encounters with the dead, and he would spend the next 45 years distilling and translating what he learned in these 7 sermons, translating them into his scientific writing. This is one of the first really complete mandalas in the Red Book. You can see a progression of moving towards mandalas, and this is in Liber Secundus Nox Secunda, in which Jung is talking with Ezekiel, the Anabaptist, and his fellow believers. What I love about the Red Book is that it serves both as a map of the territory of the unconscious and also as a prescription for how to be in relationship with this spirit world, the land of the dead, or the ancestors. So there are a couple of pieces from that I want to share. And just listen and just see what I find when I read these is that it actually almost brings that kind of presence present. And this is Ezekiel speaking to Jung. These figures are the dead, not just your dead, that is, all the images of the shapes you took in the past, which your ongoing life had left behind, but also the thronging dead of human history, the ghostly procession of the past, which is an ocean compared to the drops of your own lifespan. I see behind you, behind the mirror of your eyes, the crush of dangerous shadows, the dead, who look greedily through the empty sockets of your eyes, who moan and hope to gather up through you all the loose ends of the ages which sigh in them. There you hear the unanswered questions, unfinished business. While you mock them, one stands behind you, panting from rage and despair at the fact that your stupor does not attend to him. He besieges you in sleepless nights. Sometimes he takes hold of you in an illness. Sometimes he crosses your intentions. He makes you overbearing and greedy. He pricks your longing for everything, which avails you nothing. He devours your success in discord. There we have Ezekiel telling us the dead produce effects, symptoms, illness. He obviously got Jung's attention. Every step upward, you will thus redeem all those roaming dead. Every step upward will restore a step downward, so that the dead will be delivered into freedom. What's implied throughout this, what I learned from Malidoma and what I've also found in my own work, is that doing this work does in fact redeem the ancestors. There's so much work that's been left undone. You know, the Dogra have ancestor altars, and they don't let more than a couple of days go by before they go and they're in conversation to find out, okay, hey, what's out of balance, or hey, we need your help with this. You know, how many years has it been since we even acknowledged that they're a reality in this culture? The dead need salvation. This is a quote that everybody's quoting, and with good reason. Then turn to the dead whose companion you are. Listen to their lament and accept them with love. If there's one takeaway from this whole evening, take that away, because it's as simple as that. Complex in actually embodying it and doing it, but this is it. Whether dream or vision, Jung found that all of these encounters in which the unconscious breaks into consciousness were, these are his words, ultimately directed at this real life of mine. It's all about us doing what we're here to do, here and now, in response to and in relationship with those who have come before us, who we are particularly related to for good reason, and those who will come after us, 7 generations before, 7 generations after. The relationship between the living and the dead and those yet to be born is ever evolving and reciprocal in nature. Each person embodies and expresses, compensates for, and dreams forward some part of this infinite ancestral story. Okay. I was looking, Google Destiny and then click on images. Oh, you're going to get some really beautiful stuff. You're going to get a lot of Christian stuff about calling. Okay, I saw this and I was like, this is it, this is it. Okay, I'm going to let the image speak for itself. I put in the shadow. Okay, I'm going to speak a little bit on behalf of the image. Those things that are crossed out, I think of those things as the things that have gone into the unconscious. So, very simply, it's faith when it's here and when we've crossed it out. And when we take those cross lines off, then we have more choice. And the destiny going both ways, I don't know. Let's see. Oh, okay. Jung wrote, he wrote an introduction to Francis Wick's book, The Inner World of Childhood, which is a classic. And there are 2 things that are important about what he said. The first is that we really need to look not just to the parents, but to the grandparents and the great-grandparents, and that those will explain the individuality of the children. Malidoma says each of us comes in with a gift to deliver. We're the only one who's ever going to deliver that gift. If we don't deliver it, there's apparently a backup. So for some of us who are here now, my opinion is that there are a lot of our ancestors who were not able to deliver their gifts. And we look exceptionally gifted, you know, because we're delivering all those gifts, because that spiral, the whole fabric of being, needs each gift. Again, it's all about this life and what we're here to do. So the individuality. Also, according to Jung, neither education nor psychotherapy will prevent one's fate from being realized. Yeah. This is Jung. A human life is nothing in itself. It is part of a family tree. We are continuously living the ancestral life, reaching back for centuries. We are satisfying the appetites of unknown ancestors, nursing instincts which we think are our own, but which are quite incompatible with our character. We are not living our own lives. We are paying the debts of our forefathers. This is the dogma of inherited sin. So that man may go blundering on till he is 100. But if one gets into the history of the family, one will see. We know too little about our forebears. We go on in a terribly one-sided way sometimes because it makes sense as a historical compensation for ancestors who lived 100 years ago or more, though we think they have nothing to do with our lives. This corresponds to the primitive belief in ghosts. Whatever's the matter, they say, it is due to an ancestral spirit. One of the things I love about Jung, he's such a man of the earth, and he's so embodied. And he, in lectures, and if anyone wants references, I'm not going to go through all of this, I'm going to only highlight a few pieces of it. But he said that the ancestors seem to be in the land. And he's got a beautiful story about, right after he built the tower at Bollingen, about a visitation in a dream, and there's a historical correspondence. And so you can see kind of where that idea comes from. And when we are separated from the land of our ancestors, whether physically or psychically, it results in detachment from one's instincts, creates a sense of uprootedness and restlessness. And this leads to a dissociation between consciousness and the unconscious. He describes this dissociation in this way. The unconscious is with the ancestors down in the bowels of the earth, and their consciousness is a head on 2 feet, constantly marching about in an awful restlessness. That is the restlessness of our time, always seeking the lost ancestral body, seeking the ancestral instincts, but they are only to be found on the spot where they have gone underground. This dynamic relationship may be less conscious in, but continues to affect modern human beings. The ancestors present in relationship with the land are a living presence in the psyche of its inhabitants. The mystery in the soil, the ancestral body, is reflected in all of us. Jung talked about the complexity of the American psyche. And you just think about, most of us and our histories, and like my friend, whose story I told, tracing it, goodness knows, how disconnected we are from that lineage. And we're disconnected from that land. How many of you have gone back to the land where maybe your ancestors before they came here are from? Did you have what was your experience?
Yeah, I was thinking about how I went back. There was a trauma in my family, and I went back to the spot of the trauma and did a pilgrimage and did a ritual several years ago. It was really powerful, yeah. And I felt like at that point I'd sort of been working through that, and so when I came to that space, it felt like I saw it kind of as a gift, because I saw how much it impacted my family and some of the, the goodness that came from it, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was Yeah.
And living on this land, we're living on other people's lands. And we took that, for the most part, we took that from them. Well, the memories of those people are still in that land, and it's a big unreconciled aspect of, you know, our culture. So Americans have a very interesting shadow. He talks about Europeans having, you know, they have a nice kind of stairway, boom, 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 down to the shadow. For Americans, he goes, you go down to a certain level, it's like a big drop off. And he said that if an individual can negotiate that drop, then what you find actually is an Indian or a Negro shadow. Those are his words. But he also said that there's great potential because of this. Okay. So these are the key concepts. The unconscious is the land of the dead. The dead produce effects, good, bad, and ugly. The ancestors depend on the living to answer their questions in this time, to redeem them, to deliver them into freedom, to listen to their lament and accept them with love. The ancestors are in the land and psyche. Whether we are aware of them or not, they are having an effect on us. Psyche is multi-leveled and multi-dimensional. Our fate is woven into this dynamic, complex web of interrelated being. So what would happen were we to listen deeply to the ancestors? What is being asked from us in the present in relationship to the past and the unfolding future? Oh. The next slide. Yes! Okay, my story. Okay. I have 2 daughters. I have the privilege of being a mother. Best thing I've done yet, I think. And my daughter Melissa is here tonight with us. And when she was about 5 years old, now, you know, we've been talking a lot about the ancestors and kind of the push from the past. Well, there is also a push and a pull from the next generation and from the future. So we're sitting and we're having a normal kind of mundane conversation at the kitchen table one late afternoon. And all of a sudden, Melissa looks at me, and she just looks at me, she goes, I am here to get you on your path. I was like,
Good job.
apparently I needed a push. You don't have any memory of that, do you? No, she has no memory of that. And, you know, now that, you know, I've studied Jung and I have a much more sophisticated way of thinking about these things, I mean, it was shocking. And I realized that was the unconscious. That was the ancestors, like speaking through her. Now, I told you I had a lot of resistance to this. Well, I had grown up with the story that we were descended from Roger Williams. And this is a painting that was done. There's actually no one who knows exactly what he looked like. He was a Puritan. He thought it was vain to have portraits done. However, what I love about this is how he was different than other Europeans. Because the Indians gave him land after he was kicked out of Massachusetts by my ex-husband's ancestor. No kidding, for heresy and for saying the Indians had a right to the land and the Europeans had no right. And he said soul liberty, people should worship what they so chose, separation of church and state. They didn't like him in Massachusetts because they were building a theocracy. So he traveled for 4 months in a New England winter, left in January from Massachusetts, ended up in Seekonk first, and then in what is now called Providence. And when he got there, the Narragansett people gave him the land that is called Providence. And he refers to it as a gift of love, because they would not accept money or anything in exchange. And he considered Canonicus, who was one of the sachems who gave Roger the land, like a father. And he said these, you know, he called them Amerindians. These Amerindians were more people to me than my own people.
it's just a little bit unusual. And I love this image because it shows his humility, you know, but it also shows he always remained Christian and English. This is, okay, I'll talk about my ex-husband but my ex-husband's descended from John Cotton, and this is Roger Williams, soul, liberty, okay, intolerance, I particularly like this. John Cotton and my ancestor actually remained friends, but they had this incredibly heated debate. And so much so that there are still books that are written about the debate that they had. Put that image, and that's my daughter Margaret. So my birth date happens to be coincidental with the date that Providence, Rhode Island was burned by the grandsons of the men who gave Roger the land. Now, when...
Which is what?
What?
What's your birthday?
March 29th. The burning of Providence was traumatic for my ancestor. The effect of the Europeans' presence on this land was traumatic for the native people. This war was one of the most vicious and deadly wars that ever occurred on this soil. There's a great book by Jill Lepore, who's a Harvard professor, history professor, called The Name of War, and it's about King Philip's War, because she said this war defined war. There was more death and more destruction per capita than in any other war, even the Civil War, on this continent. And it changed the history. It changed the ecology, and it changed the history. It took a very long time for them to recover. And the Indians instigated this war because they saw what was happening. They were becoming dependent on the Europeans. And they saw the writing on the wall, and they got them pushed back pretty much to the coast. But we know the end of the story. On July 28th, in 1629, John Cotton and Roger Williams met for the first time to talk about crossing the Atlantic and coming to this new world with other Puritans. Without knowing that any of our ancestral history, when Clark, my now ex-husband, and I were picking a date to get married, we chose July 28th. Okay, you know, who was in control of that one? Oh, what I wanted to say also about the push from the next generation. So I thought it was a made-up story that my mother had, that she just wanted to find some meaning in her life and some significance. And Melissa was the one in 4th grade who said, when they were given the assignment living in Maryland to do a paper on a Maryland historical figure, she, what? What? I'm embarrassing you. I wouldn't be up here if it weren't for you, and you wouldn't be there if it weren't for me.
Thank you.
So she went to her teacher and she said, look, I'm descended from another historical figure, and I want to do my report on him. And she's very convincing, and her teacher said, fine. And she went to Waldorf school, so you have to go to the library and, you know, no computer research. And she needed my help. So I went, and the day that she got the approval to do her report on Roger, I just happened to get the genealogy from my aunt. And I looked and I went, oh my God, my mom was right. I'm a direct descendant, 10 generations, his great-granddaughter, and 5 generations back from me, 2 of the descendants from his son Joseph married each other in my line. Boom, boom. Okay. So there's that piece of the story. The other piece of the story is that I was sexually molested by my grandfather when I was growing up. I was conscious of it. I went to my mom, told her when I was 9 years old. Complicated story. PTSD. And it would return periodically. So needless to say, my relationship with I didn't go to his funeral. My relationship with my grandfather was strained, even though I told my mom it was denied. It was a big secret. My sisters, were aware of it. They were molested too. Pretty sure my mom was molested, but it was one of those things that, it was her father, just was not going to be dealt with consciously. And so I'm watching Oprah one day, and Gary Zukav is talking to a woman who's been raped, and he's talking to her about forgiveness. I got so furious. I was like, are you kidding me? She'd just been raped like a few months ago. Yeah, okay, whoop-de-doo. I don't think so. It's like, let's encourage her to abandon herself once again. And so what happened was it just triggered this whole thing. And I was like, I've had it. I'm like in my, probably almost 50 then. And I started writing a letter to my mother and my sisters about the costs of abuse. And I'm sitting there writing it. And all of a sudden, I just feel this intense love. And I smell cigar smoke. My grandfather smelled a cigar, smoked a cigar, smelled like a cigar. And I knew immediately it was him. But it was so contrary to my experience. And and then I thought, is this just compensation? Is it, being a psychologist? No, it was him. And almost in response, I could feel him kind of back off a bit, but still kind of be present. And I said to him, you have no right to love me. Go away. Well then, everywhere I went, I started finding coins. I would do experiments. Like I would look at the locker, I would have friends look at the gym locker, and I would say, okay, you guys, look, okay, so I'm putting my stuff in here. And I wouldn't have change in my purse. I would take my stuff out, and there'd be a quarter there. I'd put my water bottle in the gym thing. I'd go out, I'd see a coin on the car. So I'd check the water bottle holder, I'd put my water bottle in, I'd take it out, there'd be a damn coin there. I said to Clark, I said, do you think that my grandfather is trying to communicate with me? Absolutely. So, long story short, one morning I woke up, I had resisted doing this transferential dialogue. It was part of the coursework we were doing on the cultural and historical aspect of our dissertation. Well, I woke up experiencing the PTSD, my body's shaking. I'm like, oh God, I knew I didn't want to do this one. It was the trauma, my personal trauma, that linked me to the trauma of the burning of Providence, Rhode Island. Jung talks about images and affect. Those are the connecting pieces. So I found myself at the top of the hill. I didn't know, kind of what was happening. And the first thing is that I actually felt myself as the American Indian presence. And then there was a differentiation, and I saw him, but I could feel the pain in the land, and I could feel his pain. And this kind of suffering and sorrow lives forever until it is deeply witnessed and heard. It's a cry across and from the land that travels across and through generations. Fred Gustafson, a Jungian analyst, wrote a beautiful book in which he talks about what connects all of us is the grief that's around this story. So as I sat experiencing and witnessing the collective trauma, the ecological trauma, there was another presence that came forward, and he had a walking stick. And I knew it was Roger. And I just wanted to disengage from this, and dissociate. But there was something about their presence that helped me stay in relationship with that. And the last words that they said to me is, tell the story. Tell the story. That is all we ask. So first I thought, it's tell the story of the war. No, turns out that I was listening to the Beauty Way prayer, which goes on forever and ever. And as I'm listening to it, what I kept hearing, the words were being spoken, and I kept hearing, you are a keeper of the stories. You are a keeper of the stories. So personal trauma, ancestral, collective, cultural trauma, ecological trauma, and in that, as I become more conscious of it, is the destiny piece, being a storyteller. It's pretty cool. And in Jung, Jung gives us all kinds of ways to understand the way that emotion can kind of have a life of its own after someone dies. The psychogenesis, this is his words, of the spirits of the dead seems to me to be more or less as follows. When a person dies, the feelings and emotions that bound his relatives to him lose their application to reality and sink into the unconscious, where they activate a collective content that has a deleterious effect on consciousness. And epigenetics research is now showing that trauma, in fact, has an impact on the genes, and that it can be transmitted, genetically. Right now, as far as I could tell, the research shows that you can trace it back to the grandmother. But when we look at body and psyche as one and the same thing, distinct but the same, then, and we look at Jung, then there's no reason that it can't also be transmitted in the way that it was through my experience. So this is an example of an ancestor altar of one of the people that I worked with. Her name is Kat. She is now an ancestor. That's why I wanted to bring this in, to really honor her. One of her stories is her story is one of the stories in my dissertation. And the work is, the way that I work with people is I have people set up an ancestor altar. It's kind of a hybrid between what I learned from Malidoma Somé about an ancestor altar and doing dream work with Steve Eisenstadt and doing the imaginal work, active imagination. And through doing this work, and while I was doing the research actually for my dissertation, I had an experience of spontaneous forgiveness for my grandfather. I was in dialogue with him and with my grandmother. And it was just an opening of my heart. And it wasn't the way I imagined forgiveness. And it was kind of extraordinary because it was something I never thought was possible. I didn't even want it to happen, honestly. And when it happened, there's something that I read from Jung where it's in the Ezekiel dialogue. They're saying, we need to be released. We need to be released. And I felt in that forgiveness, that in some way he was released. And then that love that he came to me with, offering, could be shared. Another aspect of this is Roger couldn't reconcile his head with his heart as a Christian and what he learned from the people native to this land. And he wrote a book called A Key into the Language of America. And it was a representation of the two different cultures side by side. He could never find a way to reconcile what was indigenous to what was cultured, civilized. I mean, indigenous are civilized too. And what I discovered in doing this work is that I was the possibility for integrating that, what he experienced as an intercultural conflict, and a conflict between his head and his heart, and between Christian and pagan, and European and native to this land, I was experiencing intrapsychically in what Jerome Bernstein calls borderland consciousness. I had to separate the two. In doing this work, it was not only a reconnection with the ancestors, it was a reconnection and a reintegration of that, what Jung calls the archaic part of consciousness, with the more highly developed, differentiated part. As I have done that, and Roger is kind of always with me in many ways, and I have seen him, when he first showed up, he was just shadowy, and he was walking with his walking stick. He was lame, he was crippled, got probably horrible frostbite in that long journey over 4 months in the winter. And he is more vital, he's curious, he just wants to know stuff, and I've seen it have an effect on him. And that's only recently, since I've been writing the book that I'm working on. I thought I was done. It's not done. It's not done till I die. This is a fabulous book. Kat Duff is, I don't know if she's an analyst, I know she's a therapist. And she was one of those people, like many of us, who's just dashing around, doing the, fast-paced American way. And one day she just falls face down on the Persian carpet in her office and doesn't get up for hours. And when she gets up, she can't even really sit up. Found out she had chronic fatigue syndrome. As she's trying to heal from that and basically just out flat, the buried memories of her sexual abuse surface. What she discovered was a connection between her sexual abuse and personal wounding and the suffering of the Sioux, who had been driven from their land by her great-grandfather. I'm really curious because there's such, a heightened awareness about sexual molestation, and I'm really curious to know how much of that is actually related to what's living in the land and being acted out by us in this very literal way. The well-being of the Sioux tribe was intimately intertwined with the land which fed them and held the bones of countless generations of their ancestors. Forcibly removing them from their land, many suffered and died from sickness and starvation. The shaman that she worked with as part of her healing process explained that those deaths made a big gash in the land, and your body is the wound. So the official recorded history and the stories told by her family had been selectively written and remembered. These stories did not include the trauma suffered by an entire tribe of displaced people or her personal trauma of sexual abuse. This story would end up writing itself on Kat's body. She was told by the shaman that she should honor the people who died and make offerings to them. As she remembered and honored these Sioux, she felt as if a weight she had carried her entire life was lifting. These are her words. I suspect the psyches and bodies of 20th century Americans are crowded and overflowing with these ghosts of memory, so implicated in disease, because we as a people are so oriented towards progress and eager to escape the burdens and complications of continuity. It's another great book. Woman in a family of motherless daughters. She survived, so her daughter and son were not motherless. But when her daughter got pregnant, her daughter's life was so severely threatened, and the shaman, the Lakota Sioux spiritual healer that she worked with, said, she may not survive. And the doctors were all saying she isn't going to survive. But he offered this explanation to them of her story, the Lakota Sioux spiritual healer. Christy and Joe, mom and daughter, you two come from a wonderful family, a family with a heritage of many good things. However, it is also a culture that has an oppressive history for the women who live within it. She was a Mennonite. The women of your family lineage who died did so because life was simply too hard for them, and so they chose to leave. The two of you agreed before coming to this earth plane to live through this time as a way to heal that deep cultural wound. When you heal, the healing will be extended to all the women in your lineage. Christy, you have manifested 5 stones. She had 5 kidney stones. In our way, a stone is a keeper of memory. These stones represent the 5 generations of women who have been plagued by death around childbirth. The stones hold their memory. When people are oppressed, they either turn outward or inward. The women in your lineage turn the oppression inward on themselves, and their bodies are destroyed. The key to healing this intergenerational issue is the notion of forgiveness, Joe. If you want Christy to heal, you must forgive all male oppression in the world. Okay, read the book. She did a vision quest. Again, this is a long process, and she's a nurse. They did the medical intervention, it's like, use it all. The complex healing journey of mother and daughter was completed during the vision quest, in which Joellen reconnected with and experienced the oppression in her lineage, her personal ancestry and her Mennonite ancestry. Remember those levels, the collective, unconscious, and into the archetypal and cosmic level. In her words, the waves kept going on and on until I saw the oppression of the universe. A song of authenticity and love played in my heart, and a a deep sense of forgiveness to all, including myself, flooded my soul. And the pattern of motherless children ended. This work is, every time I give a presentation or write about this work is extraordinary. I still kind of have a hard time believing the power of it, because trained as a psychologist, these things aren't possible. You can't forgive all the oppression in the whole world. Yes, you can. You can't forgive a grandfather who never said he was sorry for something that was never acknowledged, that continues. I haven't had a PTSD episode for a long time, by the way, too. You can't cure addictions. One of the women that I worked with, there's a family tradition of addiction. In fact, someone in her lineage, like a few generations back, was the town drunk. When she started this work, she was dealing with a son who was dealing with addiction, drugs, and denying it. And she was right in that codependent triangle. Are you familiar with that? Rescuer, perpetrator, victim. So her son was the victim, and Tracy was either the perpetrator or the rescuer. In doing this work, and she wasn't talking about this when we were sitting in the council circle. However, she came back to one of the council circles, and she said, I went to see my grandmother, who was 92 years old. She stopped drinking. And Tracy asked her why she'd stopped drinking. And her grandmother said, I lost the taste for it. In doing this work, Tracy, and she was doing the psychological work too, Tracy started to see it in a larger perspective, and also started right now in the here and now to disengage from the role that she was playing that fed the addictive pattern. So she's doing the ancestor dialogues, she's doing the psychological work, she's doing the cognitive behavioral work. How many years is this? 5 years later, okay? Her son continued to have addictive problems. However, now, so before she shares that her grandmother stopped drinking, I have this dream, right? And in this dream, this figure comes to me and he goes, can this work cure addictions? And then he goes walking off. It wasn't a question. I was like, you can't put cure and addiction in the same sentence. Jerome Bernstein, who's a Jungian analyst in Santa Fe, was on my dissertation committee, and he read this, and what I said is you can't put those two words in the same sentence. However, here's one experience, and maybe this work, and he said to me, he works with the Navajo, and he said, you can say this work cures addictions. Long story short, her son now, after quite a struggle, and so much love from both of his parents, and his commitment to just kind of keep going, is now studying biochemistry in college because he wants to understand addiction, because he needed the drugs. And he wants to understand more about the neurophysiology and the neurobiology of addiction. So again, that's like my tell the story and a keeper of the stories. Out of the wound in that lineage comes this possibility for someone to do something with that in a way that only someone who's got that in their lineage and has that in their personal experience can do it. This is also very connected, and I want to leave time for questions, connected to the individuation process. Beautiful story of one of the women I worked with, and I want to share this small piece of it. And they've all said, please use mine. This is the other piece that's just so moving to me. They all want me to use their real names because they know that, they said, please share our stories because they know that there's value in it. So Diane had a deep sadness about not knowing who her father really was and about not being known by him when he was alive. She never felt like she could be herself with him. Her voice and individuality was sacrificed. Her creativity and femininity was feared, and so Diane suppressed it and became one of the boys. Her father collected Bowie knives, he was a hunter, great outdoors kind of guy. She became an accountant. After her father's death, she went to Mexico, And this friend drags her into this tent where there's this spiritual shaman healer. And Diane felt her father's presence as a real presence, and it changed her life. There are also lots of other things that happened. What she said, yes, here we go. During the work that she was doing with me, her father came to her in a dream and he gave her a clear plastic bag, and in the bag was a package of colored pencils, regular pencils, and a pad of paper. He said to me he was sorry that he hadn't been able to give me more gifts when he was alive. He was humbly coming to me now to give me this gift. She wrote to me, this represented him giving me a gift to support my creativity. Colored pencils to draw with and regular pencils to write with. Describing her relationship with her father, Diane said, what he took from me when he was alive, he gave back to me after he died.
Mm-hmm.
She is now a practicing shaman. She did a lot of work with Alberto Velodo, and her father has been the one, and her mother, but her father more than her mother, who has been the one who has constantly provided the support for that part of her journey as a healer, accountant to shamanic healer. One of the interesting things that I discovered was people whose parents are still alive, this work is very different for them, because remember that quote from Jung, the family complexes are still, you're kind of hooked into the here and now with the family complex. And when a person dies, it becomes more manageable. And the way Malodoma talks about it is, once they're on the other side, they see the reality of what they've done and the effects of their actions, and all they want to do is make up for it and make it better. So one of the women in the research group was just like, yes, I want to heal the ancestors. You know, she's a chiropractor and does healing work. You know, I want to heal the ancestors, and she had all these pictures. She does her first ancestor dialogue, and she goes, shit, I am not doing this. They were, they were never good to me in life. I had to take care of myself. I've been on my own. Blah 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 blah. They are on their own. I went, whoa, okay. So if anyone is doing this work therapeutically, really important to know how to support people in working through those personal family complexes, and especially if the parents are living. What I did with her was we found a grandmother who was actually quite present for her. So we found a grandmother, and the grandmother could be the ancestor that could help her, but it was still very hard. I'm not sure how this, anyway, I haven't worked with that many people whose both parents are still living. However, with Janice, she hadn't heard, after doing this work for 2 months, the ancestor dialogue and sitting in council circle, she was sitting in an airport, and she received a call from a number that she didn't recognize. It was her father. He hadn't contacted her in over 20 years. His emphysema is so bad he can barely breathe and is unable to do anything. These are her words. He told me all of his family has moved away. He has no one, and he just needed to talk to me. He doesn't know where anyone is, and then he broke down crying. He died a few months later. So the work, even though he was not yet an ancestor, after 20 years of not contacting her, he reaches out to her. I should be charging more. Alcoholism, what Jerome said. Oh, okay, this is the last thing. Catherine, back to the ancestor altar. I had a big question about, what about someone who's the last in their line? What's their story like? What are they here to do? And I've known 2 people who were the last in their line. And the first story that I heard was way before, oh my God, it was when Melissa was little, tiny. And this woman told the story about having all these family heirlooms and all this stuff that the family had collected for their entire generations of stuff. And she told this beautiful story of finding a place for all of these things, either in the world or in the trash can. Some stuff, I mean, they had saved like sandwiches that had been made in Yosemite by the park ranger people, you know, and it was like memorialized. So the park was so happy to get them. So she had this whole collection, and then she found a place for them in the world. Her whole life, she was a reporter, and her whole life was devoted to reporting on spiritual practices and spiritual phenomena. And way back in the, she's a lot older than I am, way back in the 60s and 70s, she was reporting on things like Maharishi, and she went to the Vedanta temple every day. Her whole life was about a spiritual practice. And Catherine, who happened to step forward to be in my research group through synchronicity, is also the last in her line. Very similar story. She had these boxes and boxes of stuff. She came to the first council, and we created a collective ancestor altar, and she didn't have any pictures of her ancestors. She said, I don't want to deal with them. I hate my parents, grandparents, all those people. Forget them. She came with Guadalupe, Isis, and the archetypal figures. Well, I would guess, and I don't know enough of her story, I would guess that those were the archetypal figures that somehow, remember those levels of the collective unconscious, that somehow are relevant to her personal ancestry somewhere. Well, as a result of doing this work, she opened up all those boxes that she had refused to open up. And one small piece of her story is, she's a psychologist, and she was very resistant to this work. She goes, no. I only have to deal with this psychologically. Personal is enough. And she was constantly talking about the bitterness that she feels. And I shared a story, and she went through the boxes, and she came back and she said that she never would have considered and never realized that the bitterness that she felt, that always felt like way too big and way too much for her personal history, was in fact bitterness in her lineage. And she found evidence in these boxes for that bitterness. And it changed everything for her. She too was devoted to spiritual practices, and what she did was the same thing that the other women did. She found a place for all of these heirlooms in the world. Now, when Jung describes the individuation process and the ancestors, he says, look, we're this big collection. We need to find ourselves in the midst of that whole big collection. And he uses, he uses the image of squaring the circle, gathering all of the pieces in such a way that one integrates them into oneself and really becomes that individual who you are. Now, it's a lifelong process, and I have my opinion about whether you complete it. I don't personally think it's ever completed. I think it's just always a process. And when I think about these two women, they're gathering up all the pieces of their ancestors that are still in this world. They're delivering them back into the world so they, as this last part of a physical embodiment of their lineage, can then return to the collective. So that's my current way of thinking about it. And I'm still really, anybody here last in their line? That's right. Well, hello. Okay, let's talk. Oh yeah, okay, so annual buffet, squaring the circle. That's, one of my students is doing his dissertation on image 169 in the Red Book, and you can't see it here. It's the last image in the Red Book, and it's not connected with any of the text, but if you look carefully at it, you see the faces, and you can see Goethe. How many of you have looked at that? Goethe, Jung's father. This is his ancestor picture, I think. And, here we have the skulls, and anyway, so that was cool. I'm in love with Jung now, what can I say? But I'm not a Jungian in the way most people are Jungians. Okay. So, as indicated in these stories, each individual life is interwoven into a larger ancestral, cultural, historical web of relations, placed within its own history and carrying the intention of its particular telos. Each story and each life is unique. As threads are followed, dropped threads are picked up, new lines of connection to the ancestors are made, and one may begin to discern some of the complex patterns and mend the tears in the web. These stories indicate that healing in the present may be interdependent with healing in the past and the future. Dialogue and relationship with the ancestors brings one back to the center of one's individual life. Our stories are moment-to-moment creations which in the present contain echoes from the past and the intention in the future. Each individual, each person in a family tree adds the threads of her or his life to the larger tapestry of their ancestral and our collective story. And I'll end with a question rather than a statement. What is being asked for in the present through us in relationship to the past and the unfolding future? And then, it's never too good to be too serious, and humor is great. A friend of mine sent me this. Jerome said to me, I said, damn, I wish I could learn to time travel. I want to time travel. And he said, you are. So I thought, these are my ancestors coming to stay for a week again. Look at her poor husband. Okay, so.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I would love it if you had questions or stories you want to share or whatever.
I have a story to share. Thank you. I have had many synchronicities recently. My dad just called, sorry, my grandmother's dying. He told me though that, I'm one of the only people in my family that's ever traveled or lived in California, but my dad lived here. He was in the Navy, and all the places that I've traveled in California, he has been to or lived in. And I didn't know that he had lived in Vallejo for a year, and now I live in Oakland. And then he also spoke to me about, I knew that I was related to Ulysses S. Grant, who's my great-great-uncle, my great-grandfather's brother. And he also traveled here. So I'm going to Yosemite this weekend, but I'm really emotional, I'm sorry.
That's good. Oh my God, the tears are like a blessing.
Yeah.
No.
And I was also just drawn to come and hear you speak because I was born in Providence.
Oh.
My whole mother's family is from Providence.
Oh my gosh.
So maybe we're related.
Geographical siblings.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you for your work.
I think there's a lot of grief that hasn't been expressed and a lot of things that haven't been witnessed because people didn't have the capacity to even think that way before. And those of us who have the capacity and the empathy, especially where there were wars and trauma. I mean, think about the war that your ancestor was involved in. So much grief.
Yeah, it's kept coming up over and over in my father's family.
And you're following the path backwards. I had a dream, and the message was follow the path backward to create a new forward. And Maladoma always says, you're doing it good when the ancestors are smiling. And I would guess, from my experience, that those ancestors are there with you and supporting you every step of the way. We were at Cape Cod once, and in the house that I grew up in from the time I was 10 and a half until I went away to college, and Melissa and Margaret are sleeping on the pull-out couch, and one of my friends from high school came over, and she said, so what are you doing? And I was working on my dissertation, and I always would just give a sentence or two, because you got to find out if someone's really interested in what you're doing, or I like to find that out. And so Melissa and Margaret are sitting there, and one of them, or both of them, said, Mom's doing this work so that we don't have to. They got it, and I hadn't even told them that. My younger daughter asked the best question at my dissertation defense. She said, Mommy, you've talked a lot about trauma and pain and suffering. What about joy? And what I had forgotten is that where this work actually ended up, and it was through Margaret, was in love. she played Juliet in Romeo and Juliet story. And too much to tell about that story, but it will end in love. It begins in love, and that's where you're going. Other questions, stories, comments?
In support of that, just a quick, and I can't remember if I told you this or not, but either way, I haven't told anybody else. I think it was about a year after my grandmother died, and I had a dream that she was angry with me. And I woke up and I could actually feel her in the room, which is something that I think I've inherited from the women's side of the family. Because it's the same with all of them. Which, as you know, I didn't find out until I found my birth parents and all that. So I was like, what, you know? And I couldn't figure it out. And then a day passed, and I realized on the following day I had forgotten my mom's birthday. And my grandmother was a stickler for always remembering people's birthdays, right? So she was like going, oh, wake up. And then I totally got it, right? So then I called my mom and I said, I completely blew off your birthday, I'm sorry. And then I told her the other piece, you know. And, that side of the family at one time wasn't too open to hearing about all this, but they've gotten to the point through, I guess, me just being weird all these years. Right?
Gotten used to you.
Yeah, they have. So they were like, oh, okay, yeah. But anyway, and it reminded me of the intergenerational aspect of love, of family love, you know, that it doesn't end with death.
Not at all. I've told my kids I'm gonna haunt the hell out of them.
Yeah. Lucky you.
I'm watching you.
Do special
Even
stuff.
after I die. And my mother said to my sister, who is a cognitive behavioral educational psychologist, she thinks I am loco in la cabeza. And I am, but that's a good thing, you know? What did Jung say? Find me a sane man and I'll cure him.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I've been cured. I've seen the love. Anyway, my mom said to my sister, she said, I'm going to come back until you believe. You know, and sure enough, synchronicities and, you know, yeah, they're always ever present. And just shifting, I mean, I don't think I have to, it's like speaking to the choir, I don't have to really tell any of you this, but a lot of people have a hard time accepting that as reality. So moving into it very gently. And what I love about Jung is he moves into it theoretically and phenomenologically. Don't have to have any particular belief. But yeah, things like that happen. A lot of times I'd go to the ancestor altar. I'd light the candle. My mom would be there. It's like she's just waiting because I told them, I said, look, boundaries. When I light the candle, I'm listening. When I'm not, you know, unless it's really critical, sometimes they behave. And my mom would come and she'd call your sister. You know, it's so practical. It's so about this life.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thank you, Sandra, for your, I mean, I'm just really excited about what you're doing, and I actually was wondering if you would share a little bit more about what that looks like. Like,
Yeah.
what is the Ancestor Dialogue, or what's a session like with you, or what is the group space?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for asking. From Malidoma, from the Dogger culture, red. Red is the color for people who are in the Fire Clan. Fire Clan people are about ancestors in dream. And I know all of the clans, Malidoma translated. How many of you know Malidoma? So he translated his cosmology into the Western calendar. And so I'm in the Fire Clan, no surprise. And red is the color. So first, red. Have something red. Have fire. I recommend also having water. Water, Malidoma talks about water helping things flow. Well, water also keeps the loft from catching on fire. You know? And water is always in rituals that I've done with him. You go to the fire first and then you go to the water because you need the water to cool it down and also to give it form in this world. And to bring harmony. Water is about harmony and peace. So having a glass of water or something like that. Then, no one who's living on the altar. Any ancestors from, remember those levels? So personal lineage, archetypal ancestors. I have Jung and Vine Deloria on my altar because they are continuing presence. You know, Jung, I'm getting therapy with Jung. It's my version of it. Objects like this, this ball is one that my great-grandmother, I had 4 great-grandparents, or 3 great-grandparents living when I was born, and I remember my great-grandmother, Schmidt, she died when I was like 5 years old, and so things that you have from them, and if you don't have pictures, that's great. If you don't have pictures of people, or there's a presence that's coming to you in dreams, or something that you're just kind of feeling, go and find an object from nature that represents that. For me, the animals are really an important part of it, and for many, many reasons. So, and these are gifts that have been given to me by nature or by people. So I like to have something that represents all of those levels, you know, as they relate to me personally. And then what I do, because I really think it's important to have boundaries around this, is I have a candle. I have it set up. You know, it used to take up the whole top of my desk. I've made it smaller and more manageable. And I also have a little traveling ancestor altar. I will, Malidoma says, you know, good time to do it is right before you go to sleep, because the ancestors will come to you in dreams. When you choose to do it, you know, I do it as needed, you know, and at least once a day. And so I will light the candle, I'll say a prayer, and then I'll just wait and I will see what happens. Sometimes I do it in my home. I love doing it outside in nature, you know, and when I'm doing it in nature, I'll just pick up objects from the natural world that kind of speak to me, and I'll put them around, and then I'll see who's there. And then I wait to see who really steps forward, you know, who, it's like, what is being asked of me, you know, in the present? Who is here, who is visiting? And what is it that you are asking for? And then I tell them, I finally figured this out. I was like, okay, look, you can probably do a lot from where you are. So here's my list, you know, and silly me, I have been so supported. It is such a gift, you know, but it's good sometimes to be very specific with them. So does that answer your question?
That's awesome. And also, I guess I was curious, like, what's it like to be working with you as a client?
Yeah, that's what I was
Oh,
wondering.
yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
but
what's
I
your
loved
process?
your story.
Well, that's what I have people set up an ancestor altar, and then what I find is, and I work with people individually. There's some people, it's like they're not ready to sit in a council circle, and I have a woman who's experienced so much trauma, and I can't talk about her story. I didn't ask her. Anyway, it's not time for her to sit in circle. I love working in community because something very different and extraordinary happens, and the groups that come together, there's always something about that particular group. We're the tribe, and there's something about that tribe that needed to come together at that time. You know, and it's always so humbling.
When you work one-on-one with people, how does that usually go, especially at the beginning? Like, how do you start with them, and what does that look like?
I just, you know, someone wants to see me, I just, you know, I'm not a licensed therapist, so I tell them I do soul-centered counseling, and I don't even bring up the ancestors. But usually what happens when someone sits down, I see them. You know, we come with people, you know, but a client will come in and they'll be wanting to work on something specific. And that's where I start. And inevitably, they'll have a dream or something will happen. And they'll bring in the piece of the ancestor story. And then that opens up. So I moved very, I moved very gently into this. And it's partially my hesitation. I'm getting bolder, and I am going to do, anyway. But yeah, so I start gently, I meet the person where they are, and then, one of the people that I worked with said to me, she goes, it's in your field. She said, anyone who comes to see you, this is going to open up for them. It's in your field. You bring this with you. So, I think that's true. I've always found that to be true. And it's only a piece of the work, because there are all those other pieces of doing the work.
As you know, some years ago I started doing what Jung would have called active imagination with my ancestors, and both the immediate ones but also the ones farther off. And although it's not an issue for me anymore, when I started doing that I had a lot of self-doubt about, this is, the reductive inner critic talk, this is just me making it up and stuff like that. So I was wondering how you handle that with people.
Oh, I'm so glad, because this story's been pressing on me. My mom's like, tell them the story, tell them the story. Okay, thank you. Here's the invitation. I love the interplay, between the worlds. It's like she's talking to you too. She's like, you're not listening. I'm gonna find somebody who is. Okay, my mom always asked me this question when I was a little girl. Is that real or is that your imagination, Sandy? Well, it was terrible. It's just like I was brokenhearted. But the worlds were the same to me. I was young. My great grandmother, who made that beautiful ball, said to me when she was dying, they were afraid to let me see her, and she insisted that they let me see her. And she said, "Come here. I want to tell you something. Have a secret. Just don't tell them. Don't tell the grown-ups." She said, "I'm going to be with the angels." And when she said that, I actually saw where she was going and opened that up. However, here's my mom. Is it real or is it your imagination? God bless her, because I might just still be out there being crazy. And I learned to differentiate. Well, in her process of dying, I got a call from my sister, and there's a whole year that kind of went by and we weren't sure when she was going to die. Got a call from my sister. Mom was brought into the hospital. They did emergency surgery, and she had to do not resuscitate, and hospice was already working with her, and so, we're going to, basically, she's going to die in a couple of hours. And I'm like, okay. And I'm thinking, Melissa has, tests, and Margaret has field trip, and I have clients, I have this, okay, how am I going to book the flight? And I started looking at flights online. I got a call about an hour later. Well, the hospital isn't letting us take her off the machines. We don't know how long she's going to live. And I'm like, God damn it, I'm in California, they're on the East Coast. How am I going to manage this? I have so many things. Okay, so I go down to my ancestor altar, and there's my mom, and she's got like a glass of champagne, and she's dancing, and she's happy, and she goes, it's so good to be out of my body. And I'm like, I'm glad you're feeling so good. I got some stuff to deal with here. What time and day are you going to die? Monday, 2 o'clock. Wait. East Coast or West Coast time. She's laughing hysterically, and she just goes off. I'm like, thanks a lot. It's like, okay, at least I have Monday. So I get a call from my sister at 2 o'clock, West Coast time. I thought, oh, she meant 2 o'clock West Coast time. However, my sister says, I didn't call you right away. I've been with Mom for several hours because I just couldn't leave her. Well, Carla, what time did she die? Probably around 2 o'clock. So my mother died at 2 o'clock East Coast time and 2 o'clock West Coast time. So I tell them that story because I have the same doubts, and I'm always double checking myself. And to me, she gave me that gift in her death because that's so specific. I couldn't have made it up. I might have been psychic enough to guess the time, but she did it in a very specific way that gave me no doubt. And then what I say to people is it's really up to you to decide. And yes, we're going to have to be very conscious of what you might be bringing to it that might be clouding your vision. And there's always going to be an aspect of that. However, there is a way that it feels that it's really real. Does that answer?
Good.
Make sense?
Thank you.
She's happy.
Uh,
Yeah.
When there's healing in this relationship with your ancestors, say your grandfather, is there a closure? Meaning, did he ever visit you after that?
After death,
After that, the moment when you forgave him?
he was dead a long time.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, but
Oh,
did
yeah.
Did he visit you as a spiritual presence?
He is, it's interesting because, yes. Yes. In fact, rumor has it, and we can't trace it through the genealogy, that he was Canadian Native Indian. And dream and abuse and all that stuff. And this figure came forward as this very strong Native American presence, and he's a grandfather figure. And what I realized after that moment of forgiveness is that I couldn't stand the face of my actual grandfather. So he came in that more, the cultural way. You know, it's not archetypal because it's very specific. I mean, it's some archetypal grandfather, but very specific culturally. So here's his presence that has been with me since this dream, way before the forgiveness piece. And what I realized is, and that's why it's so important to look at the levels, it's like, this is my grandfather, this is grandfather, and this is my grandfather. So now when that, when that presence is there, I know it's him. So I think when these figures are too horrific because of what our experience has been in life, they find other ways to come to us.
Yeah.
So does that answer? I just, it's, I don't know what your experience is, but really when they are heard, the love is so palpable and the gratitude.
I think that I'm assuming that for most people, Western culture in general, we would assume that this being haunted by your grandfather for the fact that there's a wound there, that he would stop somehow connecting with you after it was solved, as if as we see in movies that just like the ghosts won't appear anymore.
Yes. Oh, yeah, that would be a shame. It's the aspect that is the that piece of that energetic affect, kind of piece that lives, that is part of the wound, that disappears. And so then the person, the experience becomes very different.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One last question,
Thank
or
you. Yeah, any other questions or?
thank you so much.
Thank you so much.